Well, I am very impressed that some of you came back. Last night we looked at the overview of the sign of the cross. Why the cross? Why not a triangle for the Trinity? Why not little golden loaves and fishes? Why the cross? And we saw that of all the miracles and the healings of Jesus, they were all pointing to the cross. For on the cross would be that sacrifice, that greater love over sin and death that would truly reveal Jesus as God, Jesus as the Messiah. Tonight we begin by looking at the first person of the sign of the cross, and so we begin in the name of the Father. A reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was without form or shape, with darkness over the abyss and a mighty wind sweeping over the waters, then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good. God then separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Evening came and morning followed the first day. To begin in the name of the Father is to enter into the mystery of who God is. The first person of the most holy Trinity, God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, first cause, unmoved mover, creator of the universe out of nothing, creator of the universe out of love, the breath and word of the Big Bang, and as I mentioned last night, the second Big Bang is the creation of the soul. It is also to enter into the mystery of who we are, created in the image and likeness of God. Understanding basic human desires is necessary to understanding ourselves. Grace indeed builds on human nature, but does not replace it. Transforms it, yes. Our first experience of God the Father is also our first look at human nature and what it means for this person to need God. All of the 7 deadly sins, lust, envy, greed, gluttony, sloth, wrath, and pride, they're all primal instincts. In the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, they are appetites. These desires of human nature are, in today's computer language, hardwired. These primal instincts are powerful forces within the body and in the mind. These appetites are part of our human nature, and they exist in various degrees of complex urges and time-consuming efforts to satisfy these desires as the path to happiness. But there's a big difference between pleasure and joy. Pleasure is the result of satisfying these primal instincts, these human nature desires, by our own efforts. Cooking and eating a meal has this pleasure. These appetites, like hunger, are never satisfied for long. If the pursuit of happiness is an unbridled, single-minded focus on these human nature urges, then the result is the 7 deadly sins. For example, I don't choose to feel hunger. It is not a conscious choice when my stomach rumbles in a meeting with the Archbishop. But I do choose where, when, what, and how much I eat. In the wisdom of this world, more is always better. Therefore, if I want to be more happy, I should eat more. And therein is the sin of gluttony. With a garbage can full of empty ice cream tubs, I will be hungry again and again and again. We know the instinctual desires for food, clothing, shelter, comfort, physical indulgence, physical intimacy, family bonds, and social identity. Whenever we do things without thinking, like craving food or blurting out angry words, it is the brain that produces the desire and directs its satisfaction. That's human nature. It's hardwired. It's whack-a-mole if we try to get rid of all 7 deadly sins. It'll just creep up somewhere else because it is part of our human nature. But we will see there's only so much time in the day. If our time is spent pursuing the desires of our human nature, we'll get the 7 deadly sins. But if we're pursuing the virtues, now all of a sudden we don't have time for vice. It is not so much what we try to remove, it's what we try to take on. Nonetheless, in the physical organ of the brain are the first patterns of self-awareness. This awareness is imperfect and incomplete. In the flaw is the evidence of original sin. Up to this point, human beings are little different from creation. There is something else inside the human brain that understands there is something else about being human that goes beyond the mere satisfaction of unconscious desires. The categories of St. Thomas Aquinas help us to understand the distinct nature of human beings. There is a place. A rock is in a place. There is an environment, the place and support system where life exists. And then there's the world, the place and environments in which human beings, creatures unique in all of creation, where we live. You may have recognized this as one of the starting points for St. John Paul II's theology of the body. We are dual-natured. We are of the natural world, and we are different by our spiritual nature. By necessity for survival, we must care for both body and soul, both the environment and the world. A reading from the book of Wisdom, chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. Foolish by nature were all who were in ignorance of God, and who from the good things seen did not succeed in knowing the one who is, and from studying the works did not discern the artisan. Instead, either fire or wind or the swift air, or the circuit of the stars, or the mighty water, or the luminaries of heaven, the governors of the world, they considered gods. Now, if out of joy in their beauty they thought them gods, let them know how far more excellent is the Lord than these, for the original source of beauty fashioned them. Or if they were struck by their might and energy, let them realize from these things how much more powerful is the one who made them. For from the greatness and beauty of created things, their original author, by analogy, is seen. Over 2,000 years ago, that was written. Well, it seems that social media is agreeing on one thing. One of the top 10 things we should do for better health is to take a walk in the woods. It is estimated that over 80% of Americans spend over 90% of their time indoors. It's not just social media telling us to go outside. It's also in the writings of Pope Francis, especially in his encyclical Laudato Si. One of the central themes of the Holy Father is the care for God's creation. St. John Paul II was an avid outdoorsman. While he preferred the snowy slopes, he loved his walks too. It is in the world of nature that by analogy we see God the Creator. We experience the beauty and wisdom of the first person of the sign of the cross, in the name of the Father. There are many touted benefits for a walk in the woods. The beauty of nature can be quite a distraction from the ugliness of fighting human beings. The quiet of the forest can be a moment of peace in a noisy life. There can even be that sense that we are one with nature. True, we are creatures of the same creation. We breathe air, drink water, and eat food. We are born, we grow, we age, and we die, just like the world of nature. Yet since ancient times, this walk in the woods is not only the experience of nature, it is the experience of being different. We humans are not just different in genus and species, we are distinct in our dual nature. The age-old knowledge of this difference has posed many philosophical and religious questions. Now, that may seem too heavy for something as light as a walk in the woods. But my reflection this evening on the first person of the Most Holy Trinity, God the Father, is to point out that there is a spiritual reason for a walk in the woods that has little to do with clean air, beauty, and stillness. It has little to do with exercise or stress relief, or even peace of mind. A spiritual walk in the woods begins with the fundamental understanding that for this walk, I am different than everything I see, and that difference is key to understanding God the Father. For instance, we're the only creatures on the planet that laugh. Hyenas are doing territorial barks. Chimpanzees have to be trained by humans to look like they are laughing. In the wild, showing teeth is a sign of aggression. Dogs don't wonder what they're going to be when they grow up. Cats don't have identity crises, they just look like they do. Oak trees are not disappointed with their little acorns and envy the large, stately cones of the pines. Dolphins, considered one of the most intelligent of all creatures, they don't even know they are naked. Elephants may not forget, but judging from their televised rampages on terrified villagers, they don't forgive either. One mountain has never turned to the next mountain and asked, "Does this new snowcap make my butte look big?" No, we human beings alone do and care about all these things. We alone cry tears, both in sorrow and in joy. We alone are the only creatures who dig a grave. We alone grab a Bible and read, "In the beginning." God the Father first creates light. Light separates the night from the day. Light also comes into this brain of ours and enlightens us with the virtues and a hardwired desire for them, our spiritual nature. We desire the virtues. We are by this divine light conscious, self-aware, drawn to a greater power that has made us unique and distinct from the rest of creation. Faith, hope, and love are useless in nature. There is that beginner's philosophical question that if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound? Who knows? I know this: if I fall in the woods and there's no one around but the trees, they will not lift a limb to help me. I can hug a tree, but a tree has never hugged me back. The venerable servant of God, Fulton J. Sheen, once spoke about the reasons human beings are the only ones in all of creation who need the sacraments. Archbishop Sheen said simply, "Tell a horse a joke." Nature is at best indifferent, and at worst, downright hostile. It is important on a spiritual walk in the woods that we remember that. Otherwise, I may stoop low to behold with awe a small, lovely wildflower with an ever so delicate perfume, and sadly wonder why it never looked back at me and said, "And you smell nice and you look beautiful too." I don't take it personally when a frightened bird takes to the sky, but not before lightening its load on my head. On that walk of the woods, nature could care less about my existence. In fact, nature would be better off if humans disappeared. But why do I care? Why do we care? A spiritual walk in the woods is not about climate change, important and critical issue that it is. But if we really all cared for God's creation, we wouldn't have anything to worry about. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI once said, "We are not some casual and meaningless product of evolution. Each of us is the result of a thought of God. Each of us is willed, each of us is loved, each of us is necessary." And I'm sure the heavens roared with laughter when I was thought into being. Nonetheless, we are distinct from all of creation because we alone care. Oh, I know some of you are thinking about how your dog Spot or your cat Fluffy loves you. I'll leave it to behavioral scientists to explain how after a millennia of domesticated animals, some actually do like us. But out there in the big natural world of animals and birds and water creatures and plant, we may love nature, but it's unrequited love. Once I saw a magnificent bald eagle flying just over my head. It almost took my breath away until I saw it had a baby river otter in its talons. There's no love in nature. Ugh, why would anyone take a spiritual walk in the woods except to morbidly reflect on our mortality? The answer is an exercise of our second nature, our spiritual nature. On that walk in the woods, we are different because we alone are created in the image and likeness of God. Unlike the natural world around us, we alone were created to care. At the moment of our conception, God breathed into us a soul. And this eternal breath is returned to God when we exhale our last breath. On that walk in the woods, the pilgrim path is not to be one with creation. Rather, it is through creation that we desire to be one with the Creator. We see in the lessons of nature the wisdom of God's gift of freedom given to all of creation. We see in beauty the genius of God's design. We experience in the care we have for creation the one who perfectly cares for us. That's the best reason for a walk in the woods. For from the greatness and beauty of created things, their original author by analogy is seen. We are by this divine light conscious, self-aware, and drawn to a greater power that has made us unique and distinct from the rest of creation. God's gifts of the virtues elevates our human nature with the very being of God. Our true identity and our true joy are within the spiritual nature of who we are. Where happiness was once fleeting satisfaction of primitive desires, now joy is the gift given to us when we seek God as the ultimate desire of the body, mind, and soul. Through God's creation, we know the first step to God, the Creator. We would be surprised, maybe even shocked, to see how much of our relationship with God is reflexive, unconscious, unthinking. That is why our human nature is at best humbled by our own need for God, and at worst humiliated by our imperfections, mistakes, and sins. Sure, grace builds us up, but we never stop being all too human. Our very lives are formed and shaped by how we handle our natural desires. For example, there's a big difference between discipline over desire and the denial of desire. Discipline acknowledges the faulty wiring of our human nature. We recognize it will lead us to sin, and the spiritual wiring leads us to God. Denial is blindness, and blindness is darkness. But God said, "Let there be light." To see with all two human eyes is a physical sense. To see again through the eyes of the soul is a spiritual sense. These eyes see that all God's children, without exception, from conception to natural death, have a right to life without which there can be no liberty nor happiness. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, during a homily at the Mass for the inauguration of his pontificate, by the way, Saturday was the anniversary for Pope Francis. Anyway, Pope Benedict spoke in reference to the fisherman's ring of the papacy and the teachings of the early church fathers. He said, "For a fish created for water, it is fatal to be taken out of the sea, to be removed from its vital element. But in a mission of a fisher, the reverse is true. We are living in alienation, in the salt waters of suffering and death, in a sea of darkness without light. The net of the Gospels pulls us out of the waters of death and brings us into the splendor of God's light, into true life." The new pope went on to say, "The purpose of our lives is to reveal God to others, and only where God is seen does life truly begin." Before we can bring God's light to others, we must know that light in ourselves. We already know the darkness. This world is born in darkness. But we ever seek to come to know the source of that unique and fragile inner light. In this first look at our dual nature in the image of God the Father, it is the elevation of natural instincts that, by grace, opens our eyes to take a second look, that we are created in the image and likeness of God, and all creation by analogy reveals the beauty of God. In this second look is the meaning of the word respect, respectos in Latin, to look again. It is the sense of faith that sees all life as sacred and that we are to respect all life. That is, our first look is all too human, our second look is all too divine. Yet also hardwired is our animal nature, as I said. These appetites can sabotage and debase the spiritual character of the baptized, let alone the gifts God continues to give us. If we persist in only that first look, those first impressions, and never challenge ourselves to look again, this time through the eyes of the soul, we live in an all too human world. So our first step as a child of God is to seek and find our true identity as defined by God, not by the world. For all God's people, without exception, are created good, gifted with virtue and light, possessing a worth and dignity this world cannot and does not give to us. Thus, at the core of our identity, though bound by the same natural desires of all people, are our beliefs and our experiences that light is more powerful than darkness. The light must first chase away the inner darkness before it can shine so brightly and so grace-filled upon those around us. From ancient history to this morning's sunrise, human beings have known the darkness of sin and suffering and death. All of humanity senses deep within that there's more to life, more to who we are than the more of unsatisfied desires for the things of this world. God the Father gives us the enlightenment of our minds so that through faith, hope, and love, we may know and love the God who first loved us into being. The same inspired mind helps us to know our true selves. But what about the darkness? It is so real, so rude, so defining, so devastating in the simplest of souls. When bad things happen, as I said last Sunday at the Masses, the first casualty is faith. Then hope is lost. And then we question even our love for God. How can an all-powerful, all-loving God let this happen to us? It is the same darkness in the world that is in each of us. And so at this first look at the first person in the sign of the cross, God the Father, there's an image we can use. When we walk into a room and it is dark, we do not look for a darkness switch to turn off the darkness. There is no such thing. That is why prayers to turn off the darkness, prayers to make it all go away, whether it's globally or personally, they seem to go unanswered. But in the room, there is a light switch. When we turn on the light, the darkness vanishes. It has no power in the presence of the light. Even in a cave, where it has been dark for so long the fish are blind, one flick of a bick, or if you want to be more poetic, one lighted candle, and that ancient darkness vanishes. It has no power in the presence of light except the power we give it. The power of sin, therefore, is not what we do or what we don't do, but what it does to us. We give sin its real power when we allow any sin to define us and others differently than God created us. Sin tells us that we are less good, less than gifted, less valuable in the eyes of God. If we for a moment believe that sin can make us less, and yes, in many moments it can be a stretch to see ourselves in the mirror as the apple of God's eye, but if for a moment we feel less because of our sins, we have given the sin the power to redefine us differently than God created us. That is giving sin a greater power than God. Anytime we give something else a greater power than God, that's blasphemy. Who gives us our identity? God does. And by grace, through the best and worst of it all, that God intends for us to learn from our mistakes and become better people. Just as light banishes the darkness, so too does the power of God rebuild whatever the powers of darkness have tried to destroy. In the humiliation is the humility of spiritual growth. In our very being, we cannot allow the sin of the world to define the people of the world no more than we can allow those same sins to define us. I always like to remind people that Catholic guilt is a good thing. It is a formed conscience when we know in our gut when something is a bad thing. The problem is shame. Shame says that if I do a bad thing, I am therefore a bad person. That is blasphemy, because we are given greater power to sin than the God who created us in spite of our sins. Good people do bad things. But if bad things make us bad people, then sin wins. Do we really believe that God, the creator of all that is, created everything good, is going to allow our mistakes to define us differently? The battle of God is not with us. The battle of God is with the powers that tell us we are not who God told us we are. In that first all too human reaction to all too human sin, we can and do become shamed. But it is that second look, that grace of insight, which does not allow any sin, not my own sins or the sins of others, to make anyone, including myself, worth less. It is the grace that liberates the sinner that is one of the joys of our faith. When we go to confession, we're all conscious of our sins. Amazing when we leave, we all skip like a second grader who just made their first confession. Something was lifted. It was the very grace of God. We must know that joy in our own lives. It says something to the people around us when our words are all about the darkness of sin without providing a light of hope. We're drawn to this sense of, oh my gosh, look at the menu on television. How many TV series do we have called The Good Things of Life? No, it's all crime and people investigating it, and the more gruesome the crimes, the more popular the shows. But today people do not need yet another messenger of bad news. Today people know the darkness all too well. By our very baptism, we are declared as children of the light, not children of the darkness. We are called to proclaim good news, not just be one of 100 messengers of bad news at every given moment. The first words of God in the very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible, let there be light. Today we're called to turn on the light switches in the darknesses of our world. There's another dynamic in all of creation. God's almighty power is humbled to give us the gift of freedom, to choose or not to choose the will of God. And this freedom achieves its greatest purpose when any human being chooses to love God and freely seeks to do the will of God. It is the sin of pride that sabotages the gift of freedom and tries to turn it into personal power. In this land of the free and home of the brave, we have unparalleled freedom in politics, economics, and religion. And we've already made self-determining choices in our lives. Sin will always try to convince us that we are worth less, especially sins against the virtue of charity, sins against love. But in our very character is the free assent to the will of God. And there is no other source of joy and peace that surpasses all understanding than to do the will of the Father and choose to live our lives as a child of God. God knows better than we do that we are not perfect. And what is God looking for? For us to be perfect as sometimes we expect ourselves to be? No. God is looking for imperfect people who know they are sinners, who still dare to call out to God. Our identity begins in the beginning, and the primary choice is light over darkness. And every time we choose light, it gives glory to God. I would like to close with a story. While studying in Israel as a seminarian, one of my teachers, a rabbi, assigned to us a story to write. Many of the rabbis called ancestral stories, including the parables of Jesus, envelopes of truth. Aesop did it, put a moral into a story. You can take that moral and rewrite a whole nother story around it, and the truth is the same. The rabbis recognized that Jesus was a masterful teller of parables who would take the truths of the Hebrew Scriptures, put them into a story that both taught us universal truths and revealed who Jesus is. But that's tomorrow night. So my story I did for my class in Jerusalem, and I've written some 20 stories later, is a man named Herschel, 2 L's. 1 L means of God. I use 2 L's because I'm not so sure they are inspired writings. A Hirsch is a deer, like the deer that longs for running water in Psalm 42. So I wrote this particular Herschel story almost 30 years ago when I was on a retreat 3 weeks before starting my first assignment as a pastor. If you think you may have heard or read it before, it is because our Archdiocesan newspaper, The Catholic Spirit, published it just before the pandemic, just before Christmas. But it was heavily edited out of religious sensitivities, and now that you're getting the whole story, you'll see why. Once upon a time, not too long ago, and not too far away, but far enough to be about no one here, there was a man named Herschel. Now, Herschel was in his man cave, the garage, rearranging lumber and reorganizing his toolboxes for a project he had yet to begin, but had been working on for several years. He saw on the chainsaw brand clock that it was time to head back to the house for his nightly routine of telling his children one of his bedtime stories. Herschel wondered if his stories might someday become famous. After all, Harry Potter started out as a bedtime story, and so did The Wizard of Oz. Herschel closed up the garage and headed to the house. He just happened to glance up at the nighttime sky. He stopped in his tracks. There was a cloud illuminated and glowing. A beam of light burst from the cloud to shine on the earth below. Meanwhile, his wife Miriam, daughter Herschelette, and son Herschel Lum were watching one of those TV game shows, daydreaming about what they would do if they won all those prizes and won all that money. Suddenly, they heard somebody yelling, and Miriam hit the mute button on the remote. Sure enough, they could hear Herschel hollering for them to come outside. Fearing that he had hurt himself again, his family abandoned the TV and rushed outside to his rescue. They found Herschel standing in the driveway and pointing up at the sky. "It's an UFO," cried out Herschelette. "Honey," said Miriam, "the word is UFO, an unidentified flying object. Now remember, this is why we're not watching any more of those TV shows about aliens from other planets." Herschel Lum was using his MyPhone to take his My Pictures, and he was sending them out to his My Friends and posting them on his social network page called MyFace. The pictures went viral. Soon all kinds of people were gathering in Herschel's backyard. Some of the people thought out loud, as some of the people often do, that the sight must be some kind of light shining on some kind of holy place, or some kind of holy people, or something like that. Others thought to themselves, as some people often do, that it might be the new star of Bethlehem announcing the second coming of Christ and the end of the world. Herschel was in awe of the growing crowd. He was inspired by the growing enthusiasm for a religious reason for this strange light. He surprised himself when he announced, "Let's go on a pilgrimage." Herschel pointed to a large field all staked out for new houses. At the end of the nascent cul-de-sac was a large ridge that would provide an overview of the valley below. Herschel charged on ahead with the cry, "Follow me." The Lutherans were the first to follow, since they were always eager to discover new revelation. They began to sing hymns they knew by heart. Gosh, those good Lutherans were not only on key, they sang in harmony. One of the Catholics, in a rush to drive to Herschel's house, and he saw on MyFace that indeed it might be a divinely sent light. He couldn't find a Bible, he was Catholic, but he bought an old blue Gather hymnal that he had bought for 25 cents at a neighborhood garage sale. Catholics don't sing, so the hymnal was like brand new, and it looked like it never had been opened. The Pentecostals all spoke in a language no one else understood, but at least they were smiling, and they followed along to the beat of their own drums. The Methodists and Presbyterians were skeptical, but out of respect for all religions, they were silent and went along for the walk. The Episcopalians did what the Catholics did, only shorter. And even though the evangelicals weren't much into holy saints and holy places, they had their Bibles open to the book of Revelation and were frantically searching the pages for some clue that the light was heaven sent. Eventually, the rapturous joined the pilgrimage, because if the light really was real, and this really was the second coming of Christ, they didn't want to be left behind. There were people of other religions, too, hoping for some kind of sign, as all people do. And finally, there were people of no religion. The nothings were at the end of the long line, just in case the strange sight turned out to be something dangerous, and then they could turn around and be the first to run away. The rapturists, after causing doubt in the Catholics, went to those stragglers at the end of the line. When asked what religion they were, the end of the liners replied, "We are the nuns." And that, my friends, is a source of the rumors still going around today that men are becoming nuns. Meanwhile, Herschel had ran on ahead. He was the first to reach the ridge. He saw in the valley below hundreds and hundreds of cars. So he turned back to the other pilgrims and cried out, "It's bigger than we imagined. There must be thousands of people gathered already." As the pilgrims broke into a run, Herschel turned back to look more closely at the strange sight. His heart sank. The light was not shining down from the cloud onto the earth. It was shining up from the earth and onto the cloud from one of those million-candle spotlights. And next to that spotlight was a sign that said, "Welcome to the Mall of America." Thank you. What lights are we really following on our pilgrimage? On Tuesday, tomorrow at 7 p.m., my next conference on the sign of the cross will enter into the mystery of the second person of the Most Holy Trinity, the sign of the cross that touches our hearts, Jesus Christ. Our third conference on Wednesday will be on the Holy Spirit, the Church of Mission, and closing this parish mission with a wonderful invitation to all of us in living out our lives of faith. So until we meet again, I have 3 questions for your reflection. The first question: during this Lenten season of fasting, almsgiving, and prayer, have I made room to reflect on the beauty of nature? Have I made room this Lent for my responsibility as a steward of God's creation? Have I ever confessed that I have failed in that duty, as we all do? The second question: do I look for a darkness switch every time there's a challenge in my life? Are my prayers to God really about turning off the darkness? And the third question: where are the light switches in my life that I can turn to and turn on? Where can I be a light in the darknesses others face? We have a wonderful reception in the FCC. I thank you again for coming back. Look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow.